So welcome to another episode of The Shredder Show. An absolute pleasure today to have Craig Weller, who is a motivational speaker, a master coach with Precision Nutrition, and formerly of the US Navy. So thank you very much for coming on to the podcast and really, really appreciate your time. And today we're going to delve into all things motivation, which I know is something that you're a master of inspiring people all over the world with.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So if you were to give us a brief, 60-second synopsis of who you are, Craig, for anyone who's not aware, and your background.
So my background primarily is in special operations in the military. I grew up in a tiny town in South Dakota, and so for people in London, like flat land, prairies, cows and trees, no people. And where I grew up, there was no swimming pool. We had a tiny little splashy pool, but you didn't actually swim laps in it. So I didn't learn to swim when I was a kid, and I joined the Navy and volunteered for a special operations unit, and I didn't know how to swim. And so I learned by taking the screen test for special operations, which is like the minimal physical standards that you have to pass in order to start the pipeline. And I would take the test, fail it almost immediately in the pool. I'd get drug out of the pool after 2 out of 10 laps. But I'd fail early enough that they would just send me to stroke development where I'd learn to swim. So I learned to swim by taking the test and failing it a few times. And then I eventually passed on my last try by about 7 seconds. And then from there, because this was always my Achilles heel, I spent 2.5 years total going through the pipeline to finally graduate special operations school. And that was because I was still terrible at swimming and never really caught up to the power curve for a long time. So I was, in the first case, 2 weeks from graduating my selection course, and I failed to swim by 1 minute and 2 seconds. And I double failed it. I failed it again the next time. And so we got rolled out, and I had to spend 4 months in a development program for BUDS, which is SEAL training. And I was a SWIC student. I was going through a program for SWIC, which is a small boat unit and a different special operations unit. But they rolled us into BUDS because they were trying an experiment. And it was the first place at that point, 1.5 years, that I'd had performance coaching, that someone didn't just tell me to try harder. And the first time the coach there watched me in the pool, watched me swim, he first blamed it on my parents for not raising me in California where there was water. And then gave me 10 specific things to do, like bend your arm like this, roll your torso like this, position your head like this. And he gave me immediate feedback on that as I was swimming, as I was training. So he'd tap me on the shoulder at the edge of the pool and tell me what I was doing wrong and how to do it better. So I had a mental model and a feedback loop. And in 2 months, I improved more than I had in the previous 1.5 years. And I spent 4 months there, went back to SWIC school and passed the selection course then. But while I was doing that, I was always struggling, always suffering. Like a lot of the workouts, I could barely stay conscious. I actually blacked out in the water a couple of times, hypoglycemic shock from just running out of blood sugar, that kind of thing. I was always just at my limits. And while I was going through, my first class started with 50 people and graduated 13. And that was the one I got rolled out of. I was number 14. And then my next one went from 90 something to 30. So I was watching, because I was there so long, I was watching literally thousands of people go through these pipelines, and most of them fail or quit. And nearly all of them, with the exception of one guy that I remember, nearly all of them were better at swimming and better physically than I was. They could pass the performance standards more easily. They came from, in some cases, Division I university athlete backgrounds. There were guys who'd been competitive water polo players, triathletes, whatever, and I watched all of them quit. So I became really fascinated with what it was that helped people persevere under really difficult circumstances, like a special ops selection course, especially because it's not just physical. You need to meet the physical standards, but if that's the only thing you have, then it's not going to be enough either. And there's this strong mental or emotional component to resilience. So I spent a lot of time researching that and seeing it applied in real time in this sort of accelerated learning lab of watching people struggle and fail and quit and occasionally succeed. And I started to piece out what the factors are that contribute to that. And eventually I started coaching it. And now that's one of the primary things I do is train people. And a lot of it's based on what I learned there from practical experience and from academic mentors who are giving me the legitimate research that underpinned what I was seeing.
Out of interest, that must be fascinating seeing that volume of people going through that process. And I guess you could see everyone's almost breaking point. Was there really like a pivoting moment for you when you suddenly realized like you're not necessarily genetically gifted, but you had the mindset to overcome obstacles where others maybe had the genetic tools, but they didn't have the thought process to see it through?
Yeah, I remember there was a guy, because I was in the pipeline forever. There was this guy that I was with in training for a long time. And he was a Bud student. I was a SWIC student. But when I was crossed over as a brown shirt in the Buds program, I was helping facilitate a Hell Week. And the guy was maybe 2 days into Hell Week, and he was always physically gifted, really strong. And he was smiling when he walked by me and quit. He just, he wasn't even that uncomfortable. He was done. And I saw that a lot, not just there, but in the SWIC program and in the pipeline that I was in before, where it wasn't that people physically broke. Because it's actually really, really hard to break a body if you're just running as fast as you possibly can until you black out or something like that. It's super hard to do. And the limitation there, the factor that makes it even possible, is a mental thing. That's part of what they're looking for. Like, if you were to try just going on a treadmill and running as fast as you could until you shut your body down, like outside of a tissue injury from running really badly, it's nearly impossible. It's super hard to do. And so it wasn't that people were physically breaking, it was that something got them mentally or emotionally. And after hitting bottom so many times myself, I finally realized that I had a sense of freedom in that no matter how bad it was, I was still going to be there. Like, unless they made me leave, I wasn't going to quit, and they weren't going to be able to break me that way. And that's where I started to see the mental differences. And the same with, there were a lot of other students in the pipeline. One guy who was also, he was a Buds guy, he became a SEAL, who never did more than 6 or 7 pull-ups the entire time. His upper body strength was terrible. And I remember him like trying to work on it in his off time. He and I would go work out on the weekends or after work or whatever, try to make it better. And he just never really got that strong, but he always cleared the minimum standards. And there were guys who could do 30 pull-ups who quit anyway. And there's another guy, he's actually in the movie American Sniper. They changed his name to Biggles for some reason, but I was in training with him. He called himself the fattest kid to ever go through Buds, and he wasn't fat by normal standards. He was maybe a little chubby, but when you're running 15 miles a day, that's a big deal. And he struggled with the run times. He was in the rollback program that I was in, where I'd failed to swim. He had failed the run times in Buds. And we got him to eventually pass the run times by running like this flying V formation around him on the beach to block wind. And then we'd cycle guys through one at a time and put our hand in his lower back and push him down the beach to get him to squeak under the run time so he could class back up and finish and pass all of his run times. He was amazingly fast in the water. He could take a beating for days. He just wasn't good at running, but he struggled every day. He was out there doing the work. And you know, there's so many other guys who were phenomenal athletes who didn't struggle nearly as much with any of that stuff, and they'd go away. And guys like this guy just never stopped, and they never gave in. So it's something that's really repeated a lot, that you see constantly, that the physical side of it is really just a way of assessing what's in your head and what you have mentally or emotionally, and your ability to regulate yourself through distress or through struggle.
100%. And it's one of those things, I think a lot of people rely too much maybe on like external factors for motivation, where they really realistically need to look internally to try and motivate themselves rather than trying to look for something externally. Is that something that you saw in the military and you see now?
Yeah, you do see that a lot. There's actually an interesting correlation between external signaling devices of toughness and people who are likely to quit. So if you saw a guy who was like 19 years old, 18 years old, and just covered in tattoos, like tough guy tattoos, like I need to tell the world that this is who I am. For whatever reason, that often correlated with them quitting fairly early, because it was an external signal that was usually a compensation for an insecurity. It was a band-aid that they put over their self-perception, and it was a way that they projected something to the world that they didn't really believe in, I guess. And it's totally common once guys get through selection and they're at a team, most of them are covered in tattoos. But when they're 18-year-old, 19-year-old students, the ones that come in that have a lot of tough guy signals, are often the most vulnerable.
Is that something that you now see into the normal world when you go into like nutrition coaching and normal training, that people still have almost like these scars from maybe where they're younger, and you can see sort of patterns developing?
Yeah, and the primary, what do you call it? The research term is internal versus external locus of control. And we see it a lot in people's narratives, like in the story they tell about themselves and about the world. And when people have an external locus of control, it means that what happens to them or the course of their life is dictated by things outside of themselves. So there are people who, when they fail because of something else, because of this injury, because of this thing that happened to me, and life kind of happens to them. And they're sort of a passive bystander, where someone with an internal locus of control owns the responsibility for their decisions and their actions, and they see failure as something that they could have control over generally. And they look for the things that they're responsible for that they can control, and they look to take responsibility for those things and improve them. So when they miss a timed run, when they screw up their nutrition, when they make a mistake of some sort, they don't blame it on something outside of themselves. They look for the aspect of that they could have controlled and that they could do better in the future. And they focus on that. Where people with an externalized locus of control see themselves more as basically the victims of the world around them, and they find reasons outside of themselves that they've failed. And once they externalize the reason for their failure, then they no longer have control of it. And they've relegated control of their life to random chance.
100%. I think, is that something that with obviously the stresses of the world and the global pandemic that's going on at the moment, you see a lot more that people are playing the victim card now, that like it's very easy for people to maybe throw in the towel, say for example with gyms being closed for a while and whatever it might be. There's different challenges people have, but people have got like, it's very easy for people to use that as an excuse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a thing. And I think it's important to put it in context as well, that chronic stress, I mean, this situation is definitely going to impose an additional stress burden on people, and chronic stress does alter your decision making. It changes your ability to make decisions in the interest of your long-term goals rather than basing them off of immediate habitual reflexes. So to some extent, everyone's playing the game right now on a hard level. You know, it's not easy to make good rational decisions, to delay gratification or inhibit your impulses and keep a long-term perspective, when, especially if you're someone who's been impacted by losing your job, or you at least have family members or friends who have lost their jobs, or, you know, people who have died from the pandemic. It's understandable that people have a hard time with it. But yes, you're right that there are a lot of people who haven't been terribly personally impacted, who are kind of right on the bubble between making decisions that are in the interest of their long-term goals and just falling back to old habits and comfort food and, you know, watching Netflix and eating ice cream, basically. And it does become, I think, an easy excuse where people are able to externalize a reason for their sort of lack of forward movement by saying it's because of the pandemic that I'm not working out, that I'm not trying to find anything, that I'm not adaptable. You know, like if people want to do something badly enough, clearly enough, they'll find a way. And if they don't, it's pretty easy to find an excuse. And there's definitely an element of that where people don't have maybe immediate access to an amazing gym, so they don't work out at all. You know, they could be doing body weight stuff, they could improvise something, they could use whatever. And that was something we saw all the time in special operations. Like we never had real equipment for the most part if we were overseas, which is half the time. We had rocks and sandbags and logs and cement blocks and sometimes some Fred Flintstone weights. But we always found a way to make it happen because it was necessary, because it had to be done. And I think that's part of what we're seeing is this divide between people for whom being fit, being healthy, being sort of self-motivated is either optional, a thing that can come and go or doesn't really matter, and people for whom it's a job, it's part of their identity, it's who they are, and they're going to find a way to make that happen. And yeah, it's been interesting to see that play out.
It's it's been very fascinating to see how maybe some people rise to the challenge and some people just fall away and watch Netflix for 5 months. You probably know what I mean. Like with this sort of situation, is there anything that you say to people to try and stay motivated during these challenges times, or any strategies they can try and put into place from a practical point of view?
Yeah, there's quite a few. And I think that's important to have a real mental model or an explicit skill that can underpin a behavior, because it's not enough to just tell someone to go try harder. Like people telling me to just try to swim harder when I was a student in selection. I just got better at doing something badly. So you're not, when you say like, be consistent, exercise regularly, any habit that you're trying to produce, like in selection, it would be just don't quit. Saying those words isn't enough. You have to understand the skills and behaviors that underpin that thing. So if someone's going to just not quit, or if someone's going to consistently exercise every day, or someone's going to eat better food on a regular basis, it's not enough to just tell them to do that. You have to identify the things that happen before that, the skills that underpin that. And so yeah, with the people we were working with, ranging everywhere from special forces guys to the regular people that we work with through PN, we use a range of skills. One of them is using self-hurting. We use the phrase "quit tomorrow" to identify that, because that's how we said it in selection. When we had a really bad day, we'd tell ourselves that we'd quit tomorrow. We just suffer through the day, and then it'd all be over in the morning. And doing that takes advantage of a phenomenon called self-hurting, which is where you decide what you're going to do now based on the decision you made in the past under similar conditions. And the idea there is that our choices or our decisions don't just reveal our preferences, they also shape them. So whether we struggle to do it or we force ourselves to do it or not, when we make a decision over and over, it eventually starts to become our preference to make that decision, and it becomes easier over time. So if you have someone who's, say, struggling to stick to a consistent exercise routine, they hate working out, they can use something like this, the quit tomorrow idea, or the just get started thing, where all you're going to do is maybe the warm up, and you get through the warm up and you do a little bit more, and you tell yourself that tomorrow, if you don't want to do this, you can just never touch a dumbbell again in your life, but today you're going to do this much. And by doing that, by making the decision to move forward in real time in that moment, you're biasing your preferences and your impulsive or reflexive decision making in the future when that happens again. When you're tired, you don't feel like it, you don't want to do it, you'll think back to what you did the last time you didn't feel like working out, and you'll remember that you did it anyway. And over time, that becomes easier and easier. It starts to become who you are and your natural reflex, rather than something that you have to override with teeth gritting willpower. And there are a lot of other little skills that can go into that. There are things like segmenting, which we teach a lot of people, which is where you break an event down into the smallest manageable pieces, and you narrow your focus to just one of those pieces at a time. So if you're trying to, say you're trying to get through a workout again, you only think about doing the warm-up. Your entire world is just taking the steps necessary to do that warm-up. And then maybe the only thing you think about is the first set of the first exercise, and you only think about that thing. You don't think about the next hour of doing this, and you don't think about what you're going to do for the next the rest of the week and how monotonous this is going to feel for the next 10 years, how endless it can be. You just think about the thing that's right in front of you and you do that thing. And when you win the hour, the day takes care of itself. Or you win the next 5 minutes, the hour takes care of itself. And if you narrow your focus down and just accomplish the thing that's right in front of you, you can make that thing small enough to feel easy and manageable. And that's all the world is ever really made of, is tiny steps linked together one after another. Go ahead.
100%. One thing I was going to ask you is, do you find this works so well? Because I notice myself when I really don't want to do something, I literally think I'd rather do a million other things than whatever that task is, be work, training, whatever. Once you've done that task and you've ticked off, the feel of accomplishment, is that what ingrains in your brain to then keep you going? So like next time you get into that same circumstance again, you almost remember yeah, this is crap, I don't want to do it, but once I've done it, it's done, and then I'll feel great afterwards, if that makes sense, like a sense of achievement.
Yeah. That's definitely a factor. You begin to associate it with reward, with positive feelings, and we all have a tendency to chase that. So that's absolutely a component. Yeah. There are quite a few other pieces to that. We used to use the phrase a lot, you don't have to like it, you just have to do it, which doesn't work for everybody. You don't want to jump straight out and use that with a client most of the time. But the idea is that you're putting your behavior before your feelings. And for whatever reason, in a lot of Western culture, we really value feelings and we treat them as something that has to be turned into our identity. Like how we feel is who we are, and it becomes something that we have to protect and sort of live by. And that's not really true. Your feelings can also just be like weather passing over. It's just something, like you see that it's raining, so you wear a rain jacket and you go do what you're going to do anyway. And when you start to see it the other way, where you put behavior first, then you start to use that self-hurting effect, or that thing where your decisions shape your preferences, and eventually your behavior starts to shape the way you feel. So we like to say that you can't feel your way into behaving differently. You can't wait until you feel motivated, or until you feel like eating broccoli instead of ice cream, or until you feel like exercising instead of watching Netflix, because you never really will. Like, motivation is this really fickle, transient thing that only passes through once in a while, and it at best gets you started. But if you put the behavior first and you just do the thing regardless of what you feel like, then it will over time start to shape your preferences and change you. And that's a really powerful one too, but it does sometimes require some other tools to cross that gap. Like, it's one thing to tell yourself to put the behavior first, but it's another thing to actually do it. And sometimes there are other skills or other factors that make that happen.
One of the things I talk about a lot is the importance of discipline, and that's really what you want to be looking for, is try and become disciplined, because motivation is always going to wane and come and go, whereas if you're disciplined, you just do it regardless. Which I think also comes with something you talk about. I talk about like what's your why? Like, why do you want to do something?
Yeah.
I know you talk about having a deep reason. Do you want to go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, and that's another one that was really universal with pretty much everyone who was successful, and it was something you could see early in the people who were not. And it's sometimes it's difficult to get people to talk about it. They may not even consciously really know that they're doing it. But for me, going through when I had my worst days, like I remember one where I had a terrible beat down in the pool, and I blacked out briefly in the water a couple times, and when it was over, my friends had to pull me out by the wrist because I didn't have enough energy to get myself out of the pool under my own power. And I lived in a barracks on the 5th floor at the time, and there's no elevator. You had to walk up the stairs, and I couldn't make it up the stairs. Like I'd make it up one flight, and then I'd just kind of collapse on the floor, and I'd sit there and breathe and drink water and think about my life for a bit. And then I have enough energy to make it up the next flight of stairs, and I'd do that, and I'd piecemeal it took me like 20 minutes. And on days like that, the thing that I would think about was my dad's snow boots, which sounds really weird, But if we go back to the way I grew up in like small town South Dakota, we had two vehicles growing up. And my mom was a paramedic who was always on call, so she needed one. And then we had one other, and it was me and three siblings, four kids. And my dad worked at an office that was about a mile away from the house. And in the winter in South Dakota, it's terrible. A lot of snow, really cold, and a lot of wind. And he would go to work before we started school. Usually we'd be like barely awake by the time he had left for work in the morning. And he would walk to work and leave the other car for us kids so that we could have a warm, heated car to drive to school in. And he would trudge through the snow. And he did that by wearing these giant, like knee-high snow boots that he wore to the office, because he had to wear like grown-up shoes in the office. And then he'd wear the same snow boots on the way back. And every day I'd come home from school and he'd come in from work at like 5 o'clock or whatever. And he'd set those snow boots by the door and they'd sit there on this little tray, and you'd see the snow melting off of them in a little puddle. And so when I had my worst days in the SWIC pipeline, I would think about those snow boots, and they were the reflection or the embodiment of 18 years of sacrifices that my parents had made for me so that I could have a future and be somebody. And when I thought of that, I couldn't tolerate the idea of calling my parents and telling them that I'd given up, that I'd quit, because the water was too cold or the swim was too far. It was just too hard. Like, it was unthinkable that they had sacrificed for 18 years for me. And then I was just like, nah, it was cold, I quit. Like, I couldn't make that phone call. I would have rather they just took me to the hospital. Like, I'd rather that they just beat me unconscious in the water or whatever. So that was always my fallback when I had a really bad moment, to think about that really deep reason. And that's kind of the fail safe that people have, that when they have nothing else left, that's what keeps them going. I had another friend who grew up on a cattle ranch. He became a Marine Scout sniper. He was my best friend growing up in high school, and his selection course is similarly terrible. And he thought of we never talked about this until, like, I think we were both out of the military, but he thought of his dad had this canvas Carhartt jacket. I don't know if they have these in Europe, but it's just like a work coat, and torn to pieces, probably held together with duct tape in a lot of spots, really worn out, stained, covered in weird things. And his dad would wear that jacket to go check calves at like 2 o'clock in the morning during calving season, because this is just a thing that you have to do. You go out in miserably cold weather and you make sure that the calves that are your family's lifeline are surviving, that they're not having issues, that your financial wherewithal is not dying in a field somewhere. And his dad would wear that jacket every night to go check calves in the middle of the night while he and his brother slept, and his mom, and when he had similar low moments in his pipeline, he would think of that. He would think of that jacket and all the work that his dad put in to make sure that he had a future to take care of him and his family. And that was a very universal thing. I had a mentor who was a team leader from development group, or SEAL Team 6. And when I was in this sort of student status in the pipeline, I asked him what his advice was for anyone going through. And he said that for him, it always came down to his family, that he could never fathom the idea of quitting and facing his family afterward. And so it's not always family. Sometimes there are other factors, but everyone who was successful, for the most part, had something like that, had a really deep reason that kept them going when they hit bottom. And we'd see it with the people who didn't make it, where if you talk to them about why they were doing this, what they wanted out of this, they have very superficial reasoning. It would be things like, I just wanted to look cool. I wanted to see what I was made of. I wanted to, I want to impress people, whatever. It wouldn't really be that deep, and it would be something that could easily go away when everything else is discouraging you. It just wasn't a strong enough reason. And those are the same people that quit pretty reliably when things got bad.
I think it's interesting to see, because you can see that across the board with a lot of people where, for example, they might start a weight loss journey or whatever, and like they quit because again they haven't got a strong enough reason or why to do that, which I think is fascinating to see. I know one of the other things you talk about a lot is like prioritizing systems over willpower, because I think it's almost like, and I talk a lot of people like setting themselves up for success with just the way they like sort of schedule their day or their lifestyle just to make things easier, and you have less room for error or like roadblocks put in your way by yourself. Do you have any tips in regards to that in terms of like maybe where you learned that from the military or like through your background at the moment?
Yeah, we at PN we call that shaping the path, and the idea is that rather than forging ahead through a really difficult path, you do a little bit of work in advance and make the desired outcome or the desired direction easier to follow. The other phrase we have for that is to treat the system, not the symptom. So if you struggle getting out of bed in the morning, don't just promise yourself that you'll try harder. Don't, like willpower your way through it, but do something that increases the probability of you just getting out of bed, because that's the easier way to do it. So for me, in the early phase of when I was a student in the special ops pipeline, I had to get out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning to go do these terrible workouts. And I had roommates. I lived with, I think, 3 or 4 people total, and I was on a top bunk. And so I solved this problem of getting out of bed exactly at 3 a.m. And it was necessary that I didn't hit the snooze alarm, because it was all on a very tight timeline. Like I wanted to get as much sleep as I possibly could. And I had to be checked in, standing in a line, ready to go, warmed up at 3:45 on the other side of base. It was quite a long walk to get there. And I'd leave the door at 3:14. Like I had it timed down to the minute. I'd brushed my teeth, put contacts in. I didn't get eye surgery for quite a while, so I wore contacts. And I'd leave the door at 3:14. I'd meet a friend of mine under a street light at, I think, 3:19. And we'd walk from there. Like everything was really precisely timed. So hitting a snooze alarm for 5 minutes would ruin the entire day, because I'd miss all those timelines. My friend would either wait for me and be late himself, or he'd leave without me. I might miss getting in line, getting in ranks, getting checked in. And if I missed more than, I think, 3 workouts ever, I would have gotten dropped from the program. So to solve this problem and make sure that I got out of bed in time, I didn't just willpower it or make promises to myself. I just put my alarm clock on the other side of the room. So I had to literally jump out of bed off the top bunk onto the floor and dash across the room and kill my alarm clock as fast as I could, because I had roommates who were normal, who were in like just a regular Navy job, not a special operations job, and they didn't have to wake up until like 7 o'clock. So I didn't want to cost them 4 hours of sleep. So I'd get across the room as fast as I could and get my alarm clock off. And once I'd done that, the distance it would take to walk back across the room and physically climb back into my bed, hit the snooze alarm, like it was just really impractical. So that was enough that it never happened. And it had nothing to do with willpower. I just shaped the path a little bit. And there are a lot of devices and things around now that are really helpful for doing that. Like I saw one yesterday. I actually bought it. You can get these little things that you put in your kitchen, these lock boxes with timers on them. And there's no way, once you set the timer, there's no way to open them. There's no like bypass. And they were originally designed for things like cookies. Like you tell your kids they can't have cookies until after dinner for 2 hours, or it's for yourself if you want to lock some kind of snacks away, or people lock their credit cards in them so that if they want to buy something, they have to wait themselves out. But what I'm going to use it for is to put my cell phone in during the day when I'm trying to work, and it keeps me from goofing off on my phone. Yeah, so I'll lock it in for like, say, a 3-4 hour work block, and I can't touch it. And once it's locked in there and it's definitely off, there's nothing I can do, and then I'm mentally clear. But when you have that constant pull, that constant struggle of like, I want the cookie, like it's really distracting, and it eats up a lot of energy and mental attention and willpower. And the same thing works with, like, I mean, you work with a lot of nutrition people, and that's what we do at PN too. We really try to adjust the system so that people don't have to rely on incredible willpower from day to day and moment to moment to get something done. So if you struggle with eating junk food, if you eat chips or ice cream or whatever on a regular basis, and it's sabotaging the person you're trying to be, just get that stuff out of your house, throw it away, give it away, whatever, eat it all at once and be done with it forever, or at least for a couple of weeks, and do those things. And it's interesting, actually, the mental resistance that people will have to doing that, because a lot of people like to have these tripwires in front of them. They'll say, I want to leave the ice cream in my fridge because I want to improve my willpower or whatever. And it's a terrible plan. It's like trying to see how well you can resist getting melanoma by sitting in the sun. Like, it's just not a good idea. But some people will have a really hard time just accepting the consequence of a decision, and they'll even preemptively do that by being resistant to something like cleaning the junk food out of their kitchen. And what they're doing is trying to keep tripwires on the path in front of them so that they have an excuse or a reason to fail. And that's really common. And when it happens, then you have to address that ambiguity in that moment. Like, find the reasons why you want to have ice cream in your house. Find the reasons why that serves a purpose for you. Like, is it a form of self-soothing or self-regulation? Is it a stress relief? Is it part of a ritual? And if you can identify the purpose that it serves, then you can probably replace it with something else that can serve that purpose without also taking you away from the goals that you have.
100%. I think it's almost people intentionally set themselves up for self-sabotage, but they almost want to leave it in front of themselves as an excuse in a weird way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the same ambiguity, I think, that we all feel. Like, if we were 100% committed to an idea of working out every morning at 6 a.m. or always eating broccoli instead of ice cream or whatever, then we wouldn't struggle with it. It wouldn't even be something that we would think about. It would just be the way. It would be our normal. But we are somewhat rational creatures, and we always have a reason for the behaviors that we have. The trade-off that we're making from getting out of bed at 6 a.m. to go do an uncomfortable workout is obvious. Like, it is really nice to just sleep in and stay in bed and not be uncomfortable. But I think one of the things that we forget is that there is a big divide between comfort and happiness. And we can't directly pursue happiness in the same way you can't just directly pursue things like just don't quit. You have to address the things that happen before that, the things that allow that behavior to emerge. So happiness isn't a choice you make, it's an outcome based on a series of behaviors. And generally, when we try to reach for happiness, what we're actually doing is reaching for comfort, and we forget the difference, but we're trading the two. People are rarely very happy at the same time that they're very comfortable. Like, if you look back in your life at the things that were most meaningful to you, those were probably not times when you were also simultaneously extremely comfortable. They're probably things that you struggled for, that you suffered for, and that felt really, really good when you accomplished them. Like parenting, for example. I don't have kids, but most of my family does. And in the research on happiness and parenting, the act of taking care of a child usually rates about the same on subjective enjoyment as vacuum cleaning. People who are parents, moment to moment, are typically less happy. It leads more to frustration than it does to immediate happiness. But if you survey people on long-term fulfillment or a deep sense of meaning or the deeper joys that we have in life, people with kids are almost universally more fulfilled and have more meaning in their lives than people without. And it's a thing of trading comfort, of trading moment to moment ease and comfort for deeper meaning and happiness. I'm kind of muddling those words a bit, but if you think of, say, someone who's doing a really difficult workout in the gym, in that moment, they're not happy. They're not comfortable. They're not relaxed. They're doing something that's taking them away from their equilibrium. They're breaking themselves a little bit in order to create an adaptation. But in the end, the person who consistently does that uncomfortable thing probably feels a lot better about their life. And even immediately after a workout, the way you feel for the rest of the day is typically a lot better. So it's this sort of indirect paradox. In research, it's called obliquity, where the indirect approach to a goal is often the most reliable way to accomplish it. So if you're trying to become happy, you should also look for ways where you can become productively uncomfortable. Um, and that sounds really weird, but that's just kind of the way our brains are wired. The same thing happens in business, where businesses that set out and their sole purpose is to make money, like Enron would be an example, typically fail. But when businesses start out with an objective or a goal that is outside of making money, like say Zappos had an objective of delivering the best possible customer experience. Bill Gates wasn't trying to become rich, he was trying to make computers because that's what he really wanted to do. He wanted to make the best personal computers in the world. And he became rich, he became wealthy. But when people directly pursue that goal, they often fall short. So there are a lot of things that work best by considering sort of the indirect nature of how our minds work and how the world works in general. That there are a lot of things that we can't really directly pursue, and instead we have to identify the things that come first and look at those skills and do those things.
It's one of those things I said to people is you can't have the light of the day without the darkness of night. Like you have to, it's like the yin and yang.
Yeah,
You can't like have,
yeah,
you have to have the bad times, have the good times as well.
yeah. I was talking to my scout sniper friend about that, how we've probably felt a deeper appreciation for a sunrise than almost anyone else in at least the developed world. Because if you've been super hypothermic, like teeth chattering, bone chilling cold all night in the dark, usually soaking wet, and then you see the sun poke over the horizon and it starts to warm you up and dry your clothes out, it's the best feeling. And you would never know that or appreciate that if you were always comfortable. And yeah, that's a really good point, that without those low moments, we also become numb to the high points. Like we lose our ability to appreciate a sunrise or to appreciate good food or to appreciate physical comfort. Like sometimes it's nice to just relax on a couch and drink a beer, but if that's the only thing you do, then you become numb to it and you no longer appreciate it. It just becomes your normal. And so yeah, there's something there about producing or driving that contrast in your life, like deliberately seeking productive discomfort in order to enhance the happiness or the meaning that you feel in other parts of your life. And the needle will swing both ways. And if you just live in the middle, like mostly comfortable but also bored out of your mind, then you're you're not going to ever really appreciate or have a deep sense of meaning or fulfillment in your life.
Out of interest, I know you spoke briefly about segmenting things earlier. Like one of the things that I try to do personally is segment all the crap stuff I don't want to do into like one day or into a few hours. So that almost like that's my like negative period of stuff that I know I have to do, but I don't want to deal with. And then like
Mm-hmm.
everything else seems positive after that. It's almost like try and have like an on-off switch of the two, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That's it. There's a few different techniques for that, and it's a little bit individually variable. Like what works for you. You'll have to experiment a bit. There's a thing called the Premack principle, where people will stack something undesirable, something they don't want to do, like clearing your email inbox or whatever, and then immediately follow it with something rewarding, whatever that is, like going to eat lunch, going for a walk, eating ice cream, whatever. And over time, if you do that, then you're basically training yourself like a Pavlovian dog. You start to associate doing that unpleasant or undesirable thing with the reward, and you start to feel more driven to do that thing that was undesirable. And I do something similar. I'll stack a lot of uncomfortable or undesirable things into like one block on my calendar just to get them all done at once. Um, and I feel like that gives me sometimes better mental clarity. But it also depends on the day. Usually what I try to do is do the worst part first, like the one thing that's mentally preoccupying that you just dread the whole day, and just do that thing and get started on it and clear that away. And then everything else kind of rolls downhill from there. Everything else feels easier. But there's often like this mental resistance to doing something where it's not actually that difficult once you get started. It's just the idea of it, the prospect of it, that puts us off. Like working out can be that way for a lot of people, where once you're 10 minutes into the workout, you kind of just, you stay on the treadmill and you just keep going. But the process of driving to the gym, walking through the door, putting your stuff on, all of that, the setup is worse than the actual act itself.
100%. To start to sort of wrap things up a bit, Craig, what would you say for one final piece of wisdom, if you were going to give people one piece of critical advice to help them get started? Because I think that's where most people fail when it comes to fat loss or their own health and fitness. What would your advice be for that, for people who are sort of sitting on the fence but are afraid to maybe reach out to someone like yourself at PN or me or whoever it might be?
Well, that in itself is I think a good place to start, to look for help and look for coaching. Don't bumble your way through
It's a bit like your story.
learning by trial and error. Yeah, yeah. Find an expert. Yeah, don't just assume that you'll be able to figure it out. Like, other people have suffered and struggled and learned these things the hard way, and most of them have books or courses or coaching programs that you can do, and go do that. Like, don't just do it all the hard way. Go find the knowledge and just apply it immediately, and you'll make so much faster progress that way. I think the other one is to remember the distinction between your feelings and your behavior. That it's easy to think that if you're sad or tired or discouraged, that you should do sad, tired, and discouraged things, but that doesn't have to be the case. You can put the behavior first, despite the way that you feel in that moment, and over time that becomes easier and easier. Just remember that, happiness and comfort rarely exist at the same time, and that you have to trade them.
So it's like a seesaw.
Yeah, yeah.
If anyone wants to find out a little bit more information about you, Craig, or get in touch or anything else from you at Precision Nutrition, where's the best place to reach out to you?
Most of my writing and my work is through precisionnutrition.com. I do some coaching through them, and I write a lot of their curriculum stuff now, or I help write the curriculum. I've also recently published a book along with Jonathan Pope, who's another precision nutrition coach, on training special operators. It's called Building the Elite. And it's a very comprehensive book. It took us 7 years to write. It's basically a 400-page textbook. And we walk through a lot of the same stuff that we just discussed for the last hour or so on mental skill development and resilience and performance under stress, and how those things work. So that's buildingtheelite.com. I recommend that. And otherwise, Precision Nutrition, that's where we run our coaching. That's where all the articles live. And that's where you'll find the most resources and useful things. So pn.com, or that book is Building the Elite.
Awesome. Pleasure. And thank you so much for your time today, Craig. And I'm sure it'll be incredibly valuable for everyone to listen. So anyone who found this fascinating, which I'm sure you did, because I found it incredibly motivating, please tag me on Instagram, post your stories. I'm going to pick one person this week to win a free coaching call with myself. So look forward to seeing who enters that competition. And again, thank you so much, Craig.
Yeah, thank you.